What was the first type of sacrifice revealed in the book of Leviticus? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we begin our verse-by-verse study of the book of Leviticus on Walking Through the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Leviticus chapter 1. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 9. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Leviticus chapter 1, beginning at verse 1. Now the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tabernacle of meeting, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, When any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of the livestock, of the herd, and of the flock. If his offering is a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own free will at the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord. Then he shall put his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. He shall kill the bull before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood all around on the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And he shall skin the burnt offering and cut it into its pieces. The sons of Aaron, the priests, shall put fire on the altar and lay the wood in order on the fire. Then the priests, Aaron's sons, shall lay the parts, the head, and the fat in order on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. But he shall wash its entrails and its legs with water. And the priest shall burn all on the altar as a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. As we said in our last episode, the book of Leviticus doesn't begin where the book of Exodus leaves off. Most of it, we have an expansion of the laws given to us in Exodus. The first of these laws concerns the burnt offering. Burnt offerings have been offered before the law of Moses and were mentioned when God gave the law to Moses in Exodus, but the specific process was not. In chapter 1, God reveals his commands to Israel through Moses. The burnt offering was to be taken from the livestock, from the herd, and from the flock. That excluded some animals from being offered as a burnt offering due to God's specific commands. The instructions that we read of in this episode concern the burnt offering that is taken from the herd, as the instructions will differ slightly. The sacrifice was to be a male without blemish. This further narrowed down the animals that were to be offered. God wasn't going to accept here the female of the flock. As to why that is, we're not told here, for God will allow a female animal to be offered in other places. But since he specified a male, that's what needed to be offered. The fact that the male was to be without blemish, though, is easy to explain in that God does not accept inferior sacrifices. He deserves the absolute best. Add to that blemished animals being offered cannot really be termed a sacrifice for someone, for blemished animals are generally unwanted anyway, and it's easy to understand God's commands in this regard. Moreover, this sacrifice was to be offered of his own free will. But I thought that God was giving Israel a law here. Doesn't a law have to be followed? Well, in order to be righteous, a law has to be followed, but no, we can choose to break the law and suffer the consequences for doing so. People do that every day. It's against the law to steal, yet turn on your evening news and invariably you'll hear stories about robberies or people being tried and convicted for robberies. The same goes with murder, drinking and driving, assault, and other crimes. We have to choose to keep the law. The same goes with God. God wanted Israel to offer him burnt offerings. They would be righteous in doing so. But God didn't want forced worship. He didn't want these offerings if the people did so grudgingly. He wanted people to worship him out of their own desire to want to please him. That's because God doesn't need our worship. He will still be God in all his glory and majesty, even if the whole world rejects him. But God desires his creation to worship him, not because we have to, but because we want to. With this burnt offering, nothing was to be forced. It was to be done of one's own free will. Coming back to verse 3, this burnt offering was instructed to be brought to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. I've put up on the screen the tabernacle that we discussed in our study of Exodus. The tabernacle of meeting was the entire courtyard and all it contained. The altar of burnt offering was located near the door to the courtyard, hence why the sacrifice was to be brought there. When the sacrifice is brought, the work of the person who brought the sacrifice is not done. In fact, it is just beginning. They were to place their hand on the head of the animal and kill it, because after all, it was their sacrifice. The result of doing so is that God would accept it on the person's behalf to make atonement for him. From reading the New Testament, we know that the actual forgiveness of sins couldn't be achieved from the blood of bulls and goats. Only the blood of Christ could do that. So what is being talked about here? It's what Hebrews 9:13 says, referring to this law. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, under the law of Moses here, the flesh of man, not the spirit, could be sanctified by offering these sacrifices. Why? Because in faith he has accomplished what God had commanded. Only God can forgive sins and has promised to do so when we in faith obey him. So the person who offered the sacrifice according to the law was promised the forgiveness of his sins, which would ultimately be obtained through Christ. Even after killing the animal, the person who brought the sacrifice was not done. They were still responsible for skinning the animal, cutting it into pieces, and washing the entrails and legs in water. It would be the priest's job to do everything pertaining to the altar. They would sprinkle the blood of the animal all around the altar. They would put fire on the altar and lay the wood in order on the fire. They would lay all the parts, the head and the fat, in order on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. This would be the burnt sacrifice, and it would be a sweet aroma to the Lord, meaning acceptable to the Lord, because it was done according to his commands. With that, our time is up for today. Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Leviticus chapter 1, verses 10 to 17, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.